From the very beginning, Denver really was just the most classic mining town.
It's a boom and bust town originally, and it looks like it's going to be a big bust.
There's a very resilient aspect to people who settled the West.
If you really want to know Denver and understand why it's the regional metropolis and why it's booming so much today, that starts with these buildings.
You never get tired of walking in the building. You see the arched ceilings, the marble, the brass staircase, the stained glass windows.
The legacy that Equitable Building created for Denver is something timeless. Equitable Building played a key part in making sure that Colorado is going to stand the test of time.
This program was made possible by the History Colorado State Historical Fund,
supporting projects throughout the state to preserve, protect, and interpret Colorado's architectural and archaeological treasures. History Colorado State Historical Fund. Create the future, honor the past.
with additional funding provided in memory of Deanna E. LaCamera and members like you. With special thanks to the Denver Public Library, History Colorado, the Colorado Office of Film, Television, and Media, and to these organizations.
It was on May 17, 1792, that 24 stockbrokers met beneath a buttonwood tree to create what would become the New York Stock Exchange. The Buttonwood Agreement formed a centralized exchange for the growing securities market in the United States. As the New York Stock Exchange grew into the 19th century, powerbrokers believed that the new territories in the West offered space for the next financial empire to be built. But where? The West was hardly developed, and for a burgeoning city to attract East Coast financiers, it would have to prove that it was more than just a temporary mining town.
Denver's beginnings were very modest.
Rose Kingsley, the great English author, looked at Denver and said, "Why is it here? It looks like angels were carrying it for some more important place, but accidentally dropped it where it was at the confluence of Cherry Creek and the South Platte." An accidental city in her view.
The first settlers in Denver were miners who arrived from the Pikes Peak Gold Rush region.
The Russell boys discovered gold in the South Platte and Cherry Creek. This leads to one of the great mass migrations in American history, the Great Pikes Peak or Bust Gold Rush. That was 1858-59. It's a boom and bust town originally, and it looks like it's going to be a big bust.
From the very beginning, Denver really was just the most classic mining town. The structures, the buildings in it were very temporary. They were wood, they were dirt streets. It was a place that didn't look like it would be here in the future.
As prospectors continued to travel westward in hopes of a prosperous future, Denver was inching closer to becoming a thriving city. But in order to secure its success, Denver would need to establish a train route to bring resources and people alike. With a hoped-for stop on the Transcontinental Railroad, Denver would officially prove itself as a town with a future. Or so the locals thought.
The Transcontinental Railroad passed through Cheyenne, bypassing Denver.
And the railroad was the key to development in those days. Without a railroad, a town was probably going to die. And that's what they figured would happen to Denver. No railroad, no city. Attracting a railroad was not Denver's only problem. There was also a great fire in 1863 that burned down half the town. Then, next year, 1864, you have a flood that demolishes much of what was left in the lower side of Denver. Then there are the Indian Wars, particularly the Sand Creek Massacre, 1864, after some bitter episodes on the plains. And of course, in the Eastern press, you think, and who's going to invest money? Who's going to want to move there? But the movers and shakers here, Governor John Evans, Editor Byers, the Rocky Mountain News, the Kuntz brothers of the bank, Moffett of the First National Bank decide they've invested too much in this town just to pick up and move up to Cheyenne, which half of the city was doing.
The citizens of Denver came together and raised money to build a link to that railroad. That link came into an area that is close to today's Union Station.
There's a very resilient aspect to people who settled the West. This was a community that said, you know what, if the rail's not going to come, we're going to create our own rail. If we're not going to have the opportunities that we thought we're going to have, we're going to discover new opportunities.
People donate labor, some people donate railroad ties.
It's a struggling town up until 1870 when the railroad was connected to the intercontinental system. At that point, Denver took off.
The census figure for 1860 was 4,759 people in Denver. Next census, 1870, the population is 4,769. That's a net gain of 10 people. So here's a city stagnating, getting ready to die. The railroad arrives in 1870. In 1880, it's 35,000 people. In 1890, it's 106,000. So because of the railroad's impact, Denver does become the largest city in the West, second only to San Francisco, population-wise.
There were 4 train stations at the time, and the Union Pacific Railroad suggested combining them into what we today call Union Station. When Union Station was built at the base of 17th Street, that really anchored 17th as the major business center for Denver.
The Colorado State Capitol was eventually built in 1908 at the other end of 17th Street. You had people getting off the train, doing their business along 17th Street, and then being able to get over and do their political business along that same corridor.
Denver's big aim to become the hub city of the Rocky Mountain region is dependent on attracting Eastern capital.
Denver continued to grow, and with that growth came more permanent architecture, more permanent structures. Denver was trying to attract investors from the East Coast, and they wanted them to feel confident in the future of Denver, that this was not going to be some little town that just dried up and blew away. And by building really substantial buildings that looked like East Coast money, they hoped that East Coast developers would feel confident in investing here in Denver. One of the grandest buildings on 17th to this day is the Colorado National Bank building.
One of Colorado's pioneer banks, the Colorado National Bank, was established by the Kuntz brothers from Omaha, Nebraska. They got out here early, opened up that bank in 1862 as the Kuntz Brothers Bank.
Then there was a big fire. The Kuntz brother was able to save the banknotes and the bank ledger and also save the safe. They were able to come back the next day and resume business. They were able to help other businesses that were destroyed get back onto the track and help remold Denver. The fire actually was a big moving point for them. They moved to 17th and Larimer. They truly were outgrowing the banking system, and their patrons that were banking with them, they were growing so fast that they needed a bigger building.
In 1912, Charles Kuntz says we should be up on 17th Street with the other great banks. So they moved to 17th and Champa Street.
The Kuntzes start working to build a really permanent, appropriate home for this institution. And they come up with a building that looks very much like a Greek temple. And the reason for that is really, if you think of a temple, you associate certain things like fidelity, reliability, permanence with that kind of architectural form. So they wanted a building that spoke to the values of the bank, so that when you deposited money in the bank, you knew that when you came back to get it, it would be there. Very different from frontier banks of the day, which could sometimes be fly-by-night operations.
Colorado National Bank was built 1914, 1915. One of the things about the bank that everybody comments on is it's a bank that looks like a bank. It has that neoclassical style. It makes you feel safe and secure.
The building really has many of the characteristics you would see in a Greek temple. So there are ionic columns. There's a beautiful coffered ceiling in the banking room. And I think most notably is the use of Colorado Yule marble, a spectacularly beautiful white marble for the exterior of the building. That is the same material that was used to build the Lincoln Memorial, as well as the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier in Washington, D.C.
It really showed the maturing of the industries that were happening at that time in Denver.
When people come into this building, they are still in awe when they see the beautiful floor and they look above and see the beautiful neoclassic ceiling. It's just breathtaking. The molding that's in here is quite creative and distinctive. We have a little bit of the dental molding that's in here. We have with the curated classic scroll work that's in here and the beautiful columns.
The interior of the building features an absolutely spectacular banking room, arguably one of the most beautiful interiors in Colorado. You have to remember this dates back to the day when you didn't go to an ATM or bank online. You went to the bank to bank. So when you went in, you were immediately greeted with this interior that just inspires a sense of confidence in you as a customer and creates an environment by which going to the bank actually is an enjoyable thing to do. It's not a chore.
Colorado National Bank is a great example of combining art and architecture during the City Beautiful period. They hired the finest mural painter in town to do his masterwork.
In 1921, the bank began discussions with Allen Tupper True to produce a series of murals to decorate the inside of the building. Allen Tupper True is a very significant artist in Colorado. He painted murals inside the state capitol as well as the Brown Palace. And he ended up ultimately doing a series of murals that focus on Native Americans. And if you look carefully, what you see are Native Americans who are reminiscing in the past and remembering the bygone experience of Native Americans prior to the arrival of the settlers of European descent.
When Allen Tupper True was commissioned to do the artwork in this building, they let him set the tone and the story for what Colorado was. Allen Tupper True started her first triptych mural above the mezzanine level called Youth. To the left of the mezzanine level, we have War, and the Indian in the center of the mural talking about his experience and his memories of the war that he fought. And to the right of that, we have the Buffalo War. Throughout those murals, the vision is always going to be somewhat muted, and it's done for a reason, because when we think about our visions and our dreams, we don't always see in clear color. So the Indian that's in the truest color is going to be the one that's telling the story. People always think that it's faded, but it's not faded. It's really about the vision and the memory. In artwork, the woman that's in the left triptych mural is looking at herself in the center mural as a young woman that just got through creating a beautiful artwork. It's a tribute to women. The beautiful Indian woman is looking into the river and seeing herself as a young woman. The largest mural that we have in the lobby is called Happy Hunting Ground. It is about the Indian lifestyle and leading a good life. Happy Hunting Ground really is about the chief Indian going off into the afterlife.
In efforts to further expand, in 1925, they did another edition, very similar to the original designs. At that point in time, apparently, brothers frequently formed architectural firms. So the first building was Fisher & Fisher. The second design was by a firm, two brothers, Hoyt and Hoyt. That continued to serve the bank well until the 1960s. In the 1960s, there was a modern addition placed on top of the bank, and they created a very modern interpretation of a classical building. So the lines of the modern edition match the historic lines, but the new edition is clearly modern. In 1971, the Colorado National Bank undertook its last expansion on that site with the creation of an office tower next door. That office tower was designed by Minoru Yamasaki. He is the designer of the World Trade Center. And when you look at it, you'll see he took steps to really respect the historic building. The office tower is pulled back in deference to the historic facade. He utilized white marble so that it would blend in together. So when you look at those buildings in totality, there really is an overriding design to the complex. It's not just a building with individual additions. It all blends together very nicely. Colorado National Bank was one of many institutions along 17th that really cemented its role as the Wall Street of the West.
One of the first and last locally owned banks, the Colorado National Bank, remained family-owned for 132 years until it was ultimately sold in 1988 to U.S. Bank. Eventually, the bank building sat abandoned at 17th and Champa, facing an uncertain future, as did the other last standing icons of Denver. As Denver developed, so did its buildings. Still looking to attract East Coast financiers, Denverites took advantage of the prospering times and built opulent buildings as a symbol of Denver's permanence. Denver's growth caught the attention of Henry R. Wolcott, who would eventually win over investors in the East to help establish Denver as the Wall Street of the West.
Henry Wolcott was a Ivy-educated Brown University technical guy, very successful, very prominent, tremendous Denver businessman.
Henry Wolcott quickly realized that Colorado's economic future was tied to its development as a business center, so he contributed a large sum of money to the construction of the Boston Building. Soon dubbed the first strictly modern office building in Denver, it was built by Boston Capital and designed by Boston architects Andrews, Jacques, and Rantoul.
It was thought at that time, especially early on in Denver's history, that if you got some East Coast architects, that would be adding some legitimacy to your business and to your building.
Started in 1890, completed in 1892. This building is Denver's best example of what's called the Richardsonian Romanesque style, named after an architect from back east, H.H. Richardson. This style of architecture that features Romanesque elements such as rounded arch windows, very heavily rusticated stone surfaces.
It's right before the silver crash, and it shows you the amount of expense that they could put into buildings during really the height of a lot of the finance success that had happened in Denver. The Boston Building has that sense of permanence, but it's also very Western. It really says that this is something that was made of this area and of its time. And if you look at the foundations of the Boston Building, they're 8 to 9 feet thick in terms of how that was constructed. And it was constructed in many ways in a unreinforced masonry type of style, which was prevalent at that time. From that standpoint, it has that heft and that permanence at the bottom where people are going to interact with it, but then it lightens up as it goes towards the top. And so we have permanence and we have assuredness in this building that's not going to go anywhere, but we also have this sense of we're looking towards the future, we're building high.
Today, while the Boston Building still stands as a monument to the growth of Denver's financial district, changing times would compel an unexpected repurposing of the entire building. Diversification of businesses on 17th Street was essential to earning the title of Wall Street of the West. Beyond East Coast banks, insurance would be one of the building blocks of this aspiring Western empire. Once again, Henry Wolcott would play a key role, this time bringing a financial titan to Colorado.
The history of the Equitable Building started with Henry Baldwin Hyde. Mr. Hyde started the Equitable Life Assurance Company in 1859. He was an impressive, capable businessman, and by 1879, he had built the Equitable into the largest life insurance business in the world. Henry Wolcott caught the eye of Mr. Hyde. Mr. Hyde invited Henry Wolcott to be on the board of the Equitable Assurance Company. Eventually, Mr. Wolcott convinced Mr. Hyde to establish his Western headquarters here in Denver. So that was really the genesis of the Equitable Building.
They ended up selecting a site on 17th Street and constructed what to this day is probably the most opulent office building in Colorado.
Andrews, Jacques, Rantoul did such a fine job on the Boston Building that the Equitable Building, going up 2 years later, they hired the same great architectural firm out of Boston. Did the Boston Building first in the Richardsonian Romanesque style, then later they used the Italian Renaissance revival style for the Equitable Building. Two completely different looking buildings.
The Equitable Building is 9 stories high and enjoyed that distinction as the tallest building in Denver until 1911.
The building was completed in 1892. That's just a year before the silver crash. but they spared no expense in making that a grand office building. One of the things, if you're looking at it, you might notice is the floor plan is actually 2 back-to-back E's for Equitable. And then you see that E motif throughout the building. You'll see it in doorknobs, in the mosaic floor, in stained glass. So throughout the building, that name Equitable appears again and again. And they used really, really fine materials. There's a beautiful mosaic ceiling made up over 600,000 pieces of tile. There's a spectacular brass railing on the granite stair.
The first 2 floors of the building, Pikes Peak granite. The other 7 floors of the building are Colorado brick. It's an Italian Renaissance Revival style. That style evokes permanence, stability, strength, the things you want for the headquarters of an insurance business. You walk in the building, it's got Italian marble, it's got French marble, marble from elsewhere in Colorado, columns, floor, walls, all this very expensive marble.
And there are Tiffany stained glass windows throughout the building. One of my favorite aspects of the windows is at the very top of the stairs, and it features the goddess of Minerva, a Greek god of protection, overlooking a bereft widow and her child, showing why you need insurance. They spared no expense in decorating this building.
The news was quoted as saying that this building is a testimony to the fact that East Coast Capital now believes in Denver as a city and Denver as a commercial center. And that's really how 17th got coined as the Wall Street of the West.
The Equitable Building is a huge step forward for Denver. It's the finest office building downtown. It anchors 17th Street as the Wall Street of the Rockies. And it's a good thing it's completed in '93, the year of the crash, because after that you don't see any great buildings going up for another few decades. In the 60s, suburban flight's in full blossom. Many people see downtown as decaying. At that point, many buildings were being demolished. The urban renewal authorities all over the country.
Historic preservation has often been in reactive mode. You don't necessarily know if something is a threat until the very last hour. During the 1990s, we lost a few very, very significant buildings in Denver. We lost the Central Bank building, which was a Jacques Benedict building in 1990. It was a building that was on the National Register. So a number of organizations got together, neighborhood groups, Historic Denver, the City of Denver, Downtown Denver Partnership, and said, this is something we need to really look into at more of a holistic level. We can't be fighting, one property at a time. We have to figure out what we need to do for many of the historic buildings that we have in the downtown area.
In order to solve this problem, an alternative solution was found. Rather than designating a continuous geographic area, the Downtown Historic District would include a variety of buildings in different locations. And in 2000, it earned the name the Chocolate Chip Cookie District.
At the end, 43 properties were saved this way.
The best way to save a building is to have it continue into contemporary society with a vibrant, viable use. And you'll see that all along 17th Street. Certainly the Colorado National Bank is a great example of that. With that grand banking room, what would you do with a building like that? How perfect was it to turn it into a hotel? That's one of the most beautiful hotel lobbies in the city now, and it's just a perfect reuse of an important historic building.
Adaptive reuse really helped preserve this building. Throughout, you're going to see repurposed artwork, repurposed use of the materials that you could find throughout the building.
The Boston building rebirthed as the Boston Lofts, which is actually pretty affordable, smaller apartments, so it's a blessing for some of our students living there. It's almost a miracle that the Equitable Building is just the same as it was when it opened in 1893. There haven't been any additions, major alterations to it. It's been lovingly restored on the outside.
In 2000, St. Charles Town Company acquired the building, and they did a large-scale renovation, upgrade, a lot of cosmetic work, and they, at that time, converted it into office condominiums. Over the past several years, we have done a multi-million-dollar project on the facade of the building where we're cleaning the brick, tuck pointing the mortar, repairing the windowsills, repairing and replacing bricks, and polishing the building back up to how it looked back in 1891.
If you really want to know Denver and understand why it's the regional metropolis and why it's booming so much today, then it starts with these buildings.
The legacy that the buildings created for Denver is something timeless. The Colorado National Bank continues to thrive and will always thrive. The buildings played a key part in making sure that Colorado is going to stand the test of time.
These buildings help give Denver a sense of permanence, a place that it was going to last in a state where there are more dead towns than live towns, more ghost towns out there in the prairies and up in the mountains than live towns. And Denver might have become a ghost except for the Kuntz brothers and their railroads.
There's so many reasons that preservation is important. It creates this sort of unique sense of place that simply can't be replicated. It reminds us of another time. It inspires us with just the pure beauty of these buildings. And it also gives us, I think, something that we can leave the next generation.